but I think we'll get things started. So good afternoon, sisters, brothers, and friends. My name is Kevin Rebeck, and I'm president of the Manitoba Federation of Labour. I want to thank you for joining us to mark this solemn and important day, the National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women. Officially, that day is December 6th, but we're marking it a little bit early today. I want to acknowledge that we're broadcasting from Treaty 1 territory, the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories, we acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Normally on this day, we'd be meeting in person, remembering and honoring victims of violence, and discussing what we can and what we need to do to put an end to gender-based violence once and for all. Unfortunately, this year, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we're unable to have our normal in-person memorial and lunch and learn event, but we're grateful that so many of you have made the time to participate in this virtual version. And of course, our hearts go out to all of those who've lost loved ones and coworkers due to COVID-19. Today's event has been set up as a Zoom webinar, which we expect to last for approximately half hour. Because we have a lot of people participating, we're not set up to have participants speak, but we can receive any questions or comments you might have in the chat function on your screens. So feel free to get in touch that way. As we traditionally do, we've structured this event to have two main components. The first is a remembrance ceremony to honor and remember women and girls who've lost their lives to violence. And our MFL Women's Committee co-chairs, Melissa Dvorak and Deborah Jones, will lead that part of the event. The second part is an educational and action component. And this year we have the honor of hearing from our good friend, Sherri Rollins, about the work she's involved with under the banner of the United Nations Initiative on Safe Cities, focused on how to build a city that's safe for women and girls. Before I hand things over to Melissa, I just want to say that I continue to be encouraged by the anti-violence work that's being done by our labor movement. Whether it's important education work with our members, negotiating special supports and protection for workers experiencing violence, both at work and at home, or acting in solidarity with community organizations dedicated to ending violence against women. It's essential this work continue, and not only continue, but ramp up, especially since we know that rates of domestic violence have risen dramatically with the pandemic. We've seen how home isolation, separation from personal support networks, reduced access to social services, and the stresses and pressures of COVID-19 has increased the risk of violence and opportunities for abusers to exert power and control. As union activists and as social activists, we have to make anti-violence, anti-sexism, anti-homophobia, anti-racism, and human rights work core to what we do each and every day. I also want to thank all our unions and friends who've already participated in our special t-shirt fundraiser. The funds we're raising will be donated to women's shelters throughout the province. And if you didn't pre-order a shirt like the one I'm wearing, and you'd like to get one, we still have a few left and you can get in touch with our office about that. All the different ways you can reach us are listed on our website, mfl.ca. I'd now like to hand things over to Melissa Dvorak, President of the Winnipeg Labour Council and co-chair of the MFL Women's Committee, to lead the next part of our event and introduce our guest speaker. Melissa.
Thank you, Kevin, and hello, everyone. As Kevin said, my name is Melissa Dvorak, and it's really heartwarming to see that so many people have made the time, even during this most difficult time, to acknowledge the importance of this day, the National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women. Before we continue, I want to provide a caution or a trigger warning up front. Some of what we are going to be talking about today, much of which will be related to violence against women, have been. So if you find yourself in need of support during our counseling support, so you can either take out a pen and jot this down, or we will also put this information on the chat. First is that clinic will have counselors available for no-cost phone sessions this afternoon until 4 p.m. You can call them at 204-784-4090 to make a same-day appointment. Or for emergency anytime, 24/7 clinics crisis line is always available at 204. Many of you are aware that Canada's official National Day of Remembrance and Action has been established as December 6th in order to commemorate the tragic events that took place in Montreal 31 years ago, when 14 women were brutally murdered at École Polytechnique in a misogynistic attack. To put it clearly and plainly, they were killed because they were women. On December 6, 1989, a lone gunman entered the École Polytechnique, a Montreal engineering school, armed with a hunting knife and semi-automatic rifle. He marched into one of the mechanical engineering classrooms, ordering the 9 female students to one side of the class and 50 male students to the opposite side before directing all the men to leave. He asked the women if they knew what was going on, and he told them, "I'm here to fight feminism." He opened fire on the women, shooting all 9 and killing 6 on the spot. He then moved to the corridors of the school, through the cafeteria and into another classroom, targeting women with more gunfire and violence at each turn. The killing rampage continued for 20 minutes, after which time 14 women had been murdered. 12 were engineering students, 1 was a nursing student, and 1 was a worker at the university. Every year since the Montreal massacre, the MFL Women's Committee has hosted an event around December 6th to raise the importance of putting an end to violence against women and to raise money to support women's shelters and other anti-violence organizations in communities across our province. Gender-based violence remains pervasive throughout our society, and marginalized women face an even higher risk of violence. Indigenous women, racialized women, women with disabilities, and LGBT and trans women are among them. Later in our ceremony, we will pay special tribute to 13 women and girls who were killed violently in Manitoba over the last year. But at this time, I will ask that we all take a moment to remember the 14 women who were killed in Montreal on December 6, 1989. Genevieve, Burgon, Helene Colgan, Natalie Croteau, Barbara Daigneault, Anne-Marie Edward, Maude Havernack, Barbara Kluznik-Wadajewicz, Maryse Lagenaire, Maryse Leclerc, Anne-Marie Lemay, Sonia Pelletier, Michelle Richard, Annie St. Arnaud, and Annie Turcotte. Thank you to everyone. And now we are going to shift gears a bit because today is a day of remembrance. It is also a day of action, a day for us to get informed, a day for us to speak out, and a day for us to learn how we can make our homes, our workplaces, our communities, our cities safe places for women and girls. And with those goals in mind, we've invited Sister Sherri Rollins to be our special guest speaker today on the theme of safe cities for women and girls. Sherri, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Melissa. And thank you, Labor family. It's so good to be together. I'm sad that we're apart, but it's so good to be with the Labor family today. Thank you for inviting me home to be with you on this National Day of Remembrance and Action to End Gender-Based Violence. Thank you for ensuring too, Melissa, that we are trauma-informed and putting information that you have in the chat. I'm going to take you on a walk today. It's the worst walk we've ever been on together as a Labor family. I'm going to talk to you about what happened just last week in terms of women's violence. In Fort Garry, we saw 3 reports of sexual offenses. In Point Douglas, there were 4. Downtown Winnipeg saw 6. And this was just last week. We know sexual violence remains a highly unreported crime in Canada, and we know Winnipeg tops Canada for sexualized violence. And we know that the majority, 95% of sexual assault instances are not reported to police. And we know that that is just fine, that women sometimes do not report. We have an urgent need to respond to sexualized violence and understand that equity-seeking groups, Black and Indigenous women and girls, people living with disabilities, and gender diverse people are made more vulnerable to sexual violence in our city. And thanks to the work of Councillor Cindy Gilroy, we were the first city in Canada to be a signatory to UN Safe Cities, an initiative to eliminate violence and create safe spaces and places. But being a signatory is not enough. Women and girls and gender diverse people in our city experience sexual violence in public spaces, and it's an everyday occurrence for women and girls, resulting in fear of public spaces, restriction of movement, weariness of public toilets, parks, transit, and more. So being a signatory is certainly not enough. Actions are needed, and UN Safe Cities lays out a 4-point plan of action, identifying gender responsive, locally relevant, and owned interventions, investing in safety and public spaces, having a gender approach to urban planning, one that ensures the needs of women are taken into account across departments like planning, water and waste, public works, and transit. Changing attitudes and behaviors to promote women and girls' right to enjoy public spaces free from violence, and developing and implementing laws and policies to prevent sexualized violence. Politicians, policy actors, and leaders across the city need to grasp, though, the toxicity of anti-Blackness, anti-Indigenous sentiment, anti-homophobia, and how it impacts our residents and causes women and girls to be unsafe. The Indigenous Accord is good work towards that. The Indigenous Accord asks Winnipeg if they're ready to take action on reconciliation. To be a signatory to the Accord is not just to be in front of a podium and getting your picture taken as a signatory, or being at the Adena Circle like I was when Labour Council endorsed me and I became a trustee and then chair of the Winnipeg School Division. To be a signatory means that you are reporting on your plans and actions and your priorities with the Indigenous community. You have to do something. And back in 2014, Councillor signed, and again in 2019, Councillor signed, including city departments. They signed on to the Indigenous Accord. A year later, quite critically though, and when it came to reporting, only 4 councillors, and I'm happy to report that these 4 councillors are known to you, myself, Councillor Mays, Allard, and Gilroy. They were the only ones that reported out of all of council. And quite concerningly, many departments didn't either. Welcoming Winnipeg is another good initiative. When Welcoming Winnipeg asks who is here, and more importantly, who is not here in terms of stories remembered and commemorated across the city. Welcoming Winnipeg initiative has the potential for radical truth-telling. I like that a lot about it. It has the ability to reconcile by taking action and implementing initiatives that recognize and commemorate historical people and events and add complexity, like we're going to do with Cornish Daycare and Cornish Library, to understand that the first mayor of Winnipeg, Mayor Cornish, was also a Métis hater. And so adding complexity, maybe changing names, maybe getting some women and Black brown community names in the city. Radical truth-telling is the point of the Welcoming Winnipeg initiative. We live in a moment where we can learn about social injustices and be accountable. We can use our own workplaces, coalitions, time, financial resources to create positive change, changing attitudes, changing behaviors, creating a safer public space through accurate representation on who we commemorate. That's important for a city as deeply racist as Winnipeg is. And as a councillor, the heavy prejudice that I see every day in the work at City Hall is a very difficult part of the job. Councillors manage prejudice, whether they see it or not, in zoning, property and development each and every day. And so do our city planners, whether they see it or not. And our appeals at City Hall are ripe with prejudices around renting, around Black-Brown prejudice, those who live with addictions, and more. The work can make people safe, but the work also has the capacity to really harm people. Paramount to the job then is to recognize that city planning, urban design is not neutral. It's not neutral, and just as it can perpetuate inequity, it can also be a source of healing, but you have to see it. So people understand when an intersection is poorly designed that it can kill people, but not so much in terms of our city planning department, urban design, zoning, and permits, and how they might work together in tandem to harm. So take an appeal I heard last year, and then devastatingly heard again yesterday, just yesterday. It was an appeal of a young woman, a young mom named Satvir. She had a home-based business, a threading and waxing business, an esthetician business in her home. It's important to note that it was a threading and waxing business because, as us women know, that doesn't smell. And so when her neighbors came to committee and said, and complained against her home-based business, because, and I'll tell you that residential complaints were filed against her and her business, the Department of Planning then did something. They just provided a conditional use for her business for 1 year, which is why I saw her again yesterday. She was again facing threats to her livelihood. She was again having bylaws used to perpetuate her neighbor's prejudice against her young family. Again, a bylaw was being weaponized. Whereas you can get a conditional use for 1 year, 5 or 10, she was subject to 1 year because of the complaints. I'm happy to report that no one's going to bother her for a decade after yesterday. But the city can be decidedly gender responsive, anti-racist, or the city can decide that barriers are going to disable our people and understand, we can be understanding that the built public space is anti-homophobic, anti-trans, anti-seniors, and safe for women and girls. We can do this. City planning and urban design, while it can absolutely perpetuate inequity, it can also resolve it. And we must recognize urban design is not neutral and that it can perpetuate inequity. So while the Winnipeg Indigenous Accord and Welcoming Winnipeg are deliberate and mindful work and important tools for change if you act accordingly, we have to do more. We need a safe city by design. Safe city by design is an initiative that asks a different question. Does the way we design our city matter in the safety of our people? And the answer, of course, is yes. Safe city by design means councillors and city planners need to center city building on urban equity and anti-racism, planning, transportation. We need to consider and reflect the racial and social justice work. Increase all, so we can increase all of our mobility options and economic options like Satvir's and all of ours. To start in earnest though, we need to get the people most impacted together and have a robust conversation and consider how truth is reconciled and revealed. And we have good work. We have the framework of the Indigenous Accord, Welcoming Winnipeg, and now Safe City by Design, but there is more to do. I'll leave you with this. One of the critical problems we don't accurately understand is the truth about women and girls and gender diverse people's safety. Safe City by Design, in addition to training our city staff to have eyes for anti-racism and a gender-based approach, will also make plain what we know of the rate of sexual and physical violence against women and girls in public, who they are and where it is happening. And together with the Manitoba Research Coalition, Dr. Shauna McKinnon and others, we will figure this out because we need to have more complete conversations, ones that center on anti-racism and urban equity, and we need a safe city by design. Thank you very much. Nice being with you.
Thank you, Sherri. That was great. You've given us a lot to think about and a lot of ideas for our labor councils, our unions, and the Manitoba Federation of Labor to lobby about. Good afternoon. My name is Deborah Jones. I am the other co-chair of the MFL Women's Committee, and I'm going to lead you through the final part of today's event. In many ways, the final part is the hardest part. Our remembrance and tribute to Manitoba women who were killed violently this year. Not 30 years ago, not in some distant past, but this year. Because violence against women and girls shamefully continues to be a pervasive part of how we live every day. In just a few moments, I'm going to read the names of the 2020 Manitoba women victims of femicide. And I have to stress that these are the women that we know about. We know there are more. Up until last year, the Manitoba government used to track all the cases of women and girls who were killed by violence, but they stopped that practice. And so we have had to rely on our own research and media reports to assemble this list. We've done our best, but please have our deepest apologies if we have missed someone that you love. We also want to thank the Canadian Femicide Observatory of Justice and Accountability for their assistance with our research. It remains our hope that the province will resume their former practice, because if the government isn't tracking what's going on the ground in real time and in real life in terms of gender-based violence, then it's hard to imagine how they're going to develop and implement the right policy responses to end gender-based violence. We want to make sure that women are always treated and remembered as cherished human beings and not simply crime statistics. We invite you now to bow your heads as we read the names of the women and girls who lost their lives as a result of acts of violence in our province since December the 6th of last year. Regan Danielle Gross, 49 years old, was killed in Winnipeg on January the 10th. A 35-year-old woman in Lake Manitoba First Nation was killed on March the 26th, 2020. Her name was not released. Aisha Hudson, a young Indigenous woman, only 16 years old, was shot and killed by Winnipeg police. Raquel Callum, also a young Indigenous woman, only 15 years old, was shot and killed in Wayway-Sakapo First Nation on April the 11th. Julie Rachette, age 34, was killed in what appears to be a domestic homicide on April the 11th. Mary Moran, age 46, was also killed in what appears to be a domestic homicide on May the 15th. On June the 26th, a 22-year-old Indigenous woman, a member of the Matthias Kalom Cree Nation, was found dead in her home. Her name was not released. Danielle Dawn Cote, a 27-year-old Indigenous woman, was shot and killed in Winnipeg on July the 1st. Danielle Harper, a 35-year-old Indigenous woman, was found murdered on July the 23rd in Winnipeg after going missing on July the 12th. Tamara Norman Beno, 36-year-old Indigenous woman, missing since May, was found murdered on September the 3rd in the area of Portage Prairie in the Long Plain First Nation. On September the 24th, an Indigenous woman was found murdered in St. Teresa Point First Nation. Her name was not released. Denise Akobe, age 33, and her 8-month-old daughter Landon were found dead following a suspicious fire in Winnipeg. The case is still under investigation. We invite you now to join us in observing a moment of silence as we remember and honor these women and girls.
Thank you, everyone. May we never forget the sisters and friends we've lost, and may we continue the struggle to stop violence in all its forms. A special thank you to Deb and Melissa for leading our event today, and also to Sherri Rollins for sharing her insights with us. This concludes our event. Thank you for taking the time to mark this day of remembrance and action. We hope to be able to meet in person next year. And to all those essential service workers who continue to put themselves at risk to support and care for us, thank you. To the family and friends of people who've been lost to COVID, our hearts go out to you as well. Be well, stay safe, everyone. Thanks very much.